Check 1 2. This is Double O and we are back. New name, same game. Do not turn your radio dial. This has not been secretly downloaded into your podcast feed. This is Double O, and this is a podcast that you used to know, but we got a new name. Think Like a Rapper. If you were a fan of the Free Range podcast that I started last year, this will be more of the same with a slightly tighter focus. When I started the original podcast, I always had this thesis that I wanted to talk about really big conversations, but stemming from the mindset of hip hop culture. That will continue and get bigger and better now, but I believe that Think Like a Rapper makes a little bit more sense with what I'm trying to convey, which is simply that hip hop is such a strong cultural language that we can parse its practices, its mindset, and so much more into real world, actionable items that we can kind of all use in our everyday life. And so my point is to interview people in and around the space, anybody that fell in love with hip hop and it inspired them in their career path. And in talking to them, I hope to potentially inspire you, but really codify those practices that they've learned along the way and try to make that something that you can use in your everyday life. I also moved back to New York City. LA was great. LA is an amazing place for lifestyle, but I feel like I needed to get punched in the face by New York winter one time to get back on my grind. It's been great here though, but it's still only 50 degrees. But as soon as I touched down, I had to get up with the plug. My man, Jesse Kirshbaum. I met him some years ago when Kids in the Hall was looking for a booking agent to do more college shows. He was someone who was really key in that market. If you've heard the names, the Clips, Wale, J. Cole, Mike Posner, Big Sean, then behind the scenes of all that, when they came to your college, was a man by the name of Jesse Kirshbaum and the Nue Agency. They were instrumental in building those artists at a grassroots level through the university system and eventually scaling them up to the superstars that they became. At a certain point, though, it became difficult to retain talent, and so he had to make a shift. He'd been building relationships in the tech space and in the brand space with these artists and decided to reorient Nue Agency so that it wasn't necessarily representing artists and presenting them to brands, but representing brands and building out their artist and music relationships. He also went on to partner with Elliott Wilson in starting the Crown interview series, which has been transformative in the way that we now view the live interview. So let's get to it. Jesse Kirshbaum, Nue Agency, Think Like a Rapper. Follow me on everything at Think Like a Rapper. Let's get it. What up, it's your double man, Double O, and I am back. It is 2020, and it's been a long time. I shouldn't have left you. But I'm here. I moved. I'm in New York City, and might as well kick it off with my homie, Jesse Kirshbaum, head of the Nue Agency. I've known him for years. I've known him in a number of iterations, and we actually got to reconnect at a Christmas party that you had booked Lupe Fiasco at, and
a Christmas party at Sadel's.
Yes.
Now that was fun.
And for the people who don't know, Sadel's.
Sadel's is part of the Major Food Group. So it's this amazing conglomerate of restaurants started by Mario Carbone and Rich Teresi. Mm-hmm. And this is their Jewish restaurant. So they've got Carbone's, they've got Parm, they've got a couple others, Santini, but this is their Jewish lox and bagels, New York, Extremely West Village staple.
Yeah, and it was amazing, hilarious, and fun experience always to do those sort of events and perform hits with Lupe. But we always enjoy it. But when I first met you, you were doing the reverse. You were, or maybe I guess you were a booking agent. I met you 8 years ago now, and at the time, the Nue Agency was an independent booking agency. You had the Clips, I think, in Wale at the time, right? But I want to start there. Before that enters into your world, what are your first memories of feeling the pull of hip hop, like to be involved in it?
I first fell in love with hip hop in high school. And that's really when I first fell in love with music. And it starts really when I got my car, or when my friends started getting their car. And we would drive around. I was in the suburbs. I was a Brooklyn native, but I moved out to Westchester in 6th grade. And about 9th grade, 10th grade, started cruising around. And that was how we could come to the city, and that's how we would go to the Bronx, and that's how we would pick up our chronic. And my friends started to play singles from everybody from Busta Rhymes to Biggie to even, what was the guy's, Lyrical Gangster?
I'm trying to remember. I don't know. My hip hop.
Murderer, I'm the Lyrical Gangster.
Yes. Wait, 9?
I don't remember that
He had
song
the crazy
so much.
voice?
It didn't translate, but these were the songs that were just in the tape cassette singles that my friend who had the polished up Mustang would pick us up after school.
5.0 or
I don't even remember the whip.
was the back seat extremely small?
Backseat was small, and he did put a spoiler on it.
Okay.
So I started to love the sound, and then when I finally got my own car, that's when I really started to listen to music. And a friend of mine, who's now a DJ, handed me a mixtape that he custom made for me, like to celebrate me getting my license at 16. At that point, I was blown away. You could start hearing the Smith & Wessons and the Mobb Deeps and all these Biggies and bad boy raps coming up. And I was just, holy cow, this is amazing. And as I dug deeper and got more obsessed, I started to hear the West Coast sound and really fall in love with Pac and Dre and Snoop. And I was just involved in that kind of East Coast, West Coast pull. And Puff was just, anything he touched at the time was just New York. Yeah. And it was glitzy and it was glamorous and it felt so good. And I was just dreaming of living in New York and that life and just loving the music, and these hits from the 80s sounded so crazy. He just was speaking to me, and I was up on it early and I was getting the mixtapes. And then a girlfriend of mine whose father was a record executive, my first love, my first girlfriend, had a sister who was a casting agent. And I'm like living as much hip hop as I could at the time, but not really at all in the scene.
Yeah.
And she says, would you want to be in a Puff Daddy music video? So I'm 17, I'm a senior in high school, and I'm in It's All About the Benjamins.
Really?
I'm with dyed blonde hair before Eminem even existed, with a visor on backwards in the Query in way out in Jersey, and everybody's super paranoid because Biggie had just gotten killed. And they're in baseball jerseys, and I met Lil' Kim, and I met the Lox, and I met Puff, and it's this shoot that goes from 6 p.m. to 10 a.m. all night, and they paid me $300, and I was like, this is so awesome.
Right.
This is the greatest experience ever. I go to college, don't think much more about it, but when I get to college in Wisconsin, all of a sudden, people are starting to say, like, I can't believe this guy was in a Puff Daddy music video. I know all the words. Another big thing in high school that I forgot to mention was I threw all the parties. So I started to realize pretty early on that what makes the parties better, sure, you need interesting people and you need libations and it needs to be around a celebration like a football game. But what really made the parties better was music. So as I started to lace in music and DJs into the high school keg parties, on top of that, I was the president of my high school. So every assembly, announcement, pep rally, I also played music. I started to see that like music got everything better, was the big connector. So when I get to college and I'm thinking I'm going to be a business or political science major, I come home from Thanksgiving freshman year and I'm looking out the window and I realize that moment in that video was so inspiring, and all of this love I have for music, watching MTV and BET every day after school, this is what I want to do. I want to be in the business of music. And I basically changed my major into business and studied international business in college because Wisconsin definitely didn't have a music program. Now they do. Believe it or not, University of Wisconsin now gives scholarships to rappers.
Amazing.
They have a hip-hop program at the University of Wisconsin. I can only imagine what it would have been like if I had that while I was there. But anyway, there was no music program, so I had to learn from internships. I had to hustle my way in the door. But it was all in college where I really started to realize this is what I want to do. And now 20 years later, I sometimes have to pinch myself.
And so when you realized that music was kind of the secret sauce during that time, you never wanted to be a DJ?
I didn't want to be a DJ. I was making mixes and I was making playlists, but I never thought about being a DJ. The tools weren't necessarily out there. Some people I know were DJing, and we did have turntables constantly being set up in apartments or friends. I just, for some reason, wasn't the interest. I was much more passionate about dance and movement and organizing the events and connecting with the people at them. And I felt like being a DJ would hold me back from what my strength was, which was connecting with the people on a kind of a mouth-to-mouth handshake kind of level. I used to joke that my hand would hurt after a good Friday or Saturday night because I slapped so many fives.
And so you get out of school. I assume you come back to New York. And then what's the next step? What's the first place that you land?
I had some great internships that I hustled in college, just foot in the door, but didn't land me a job after college. While I was in college, Billboard offered me a job to come on full time and drop out of school, but it wasn't an option for me. So when I got out of college, I was trying to figure out what to do, and I basically called every record label that I could find. I was obsessed with the thinking that electronic music was going to be the next big wave. And so I called every electronic record label. And I ended up getting a job making coffee at a company called Logic Records. And this was in the same building as like Shady Records. It was a boutique right above Supreme in Soho. I thought it was cool, but I didn't think there was much of a business model there. Felt like they were giving away more records than they were selling. And yeah, I was going out and I was getting in the mix, and I liked it. I just didn't love the music. I didn't love the positioning of the record business, especially in electronic. So then I was looking at law school, and I was starting to study. And then a family friend who's a lawyer came to me and said, "You're already in the mix. You're already throwing parties. You're already out all the time. You shouldn't be a lawyer. You don't want to do contracts. You don't want to go to trial. You should be an agent. That's where the deals are, and that's the best place to learn." So I got a hold of a resource called Celebrity Access, got myself a week trial membership, stayed home, and called every single record label agency that I could find begging for a job. And I came across one agency, a boutique, that had just fired their assistant, the CEO, and he was like, I caught him on the phone somehow, and he was like, "You're hired, come in tomorrow for an interview." And I was like, "I'm hired or I have an interview?" And he basically looked at his watch when I met with him and said, "Start tomorrow." and I was off to the races doing like the B2K contracts and the Scream 2 tour contracts. And essentially, I didn't know what I was doing, but because I went the boutique route, I was able to skip the mailroom and go straight to assistant. During that time, I called so many agencies. 3 weeks later, another agency called me. And that agency said, we had something open up. We liked your energy, but there wasn't something available now. There's something available. There wasn't something available then, but there's something available now. Would you consider coming in? And I said, I already got a job. And they said, who are you working for? And I said, the company I was working at, Pyramid Entertainment. And the guy said, I hate that guy. I used to work with them. I'll pay you more money. Can you work with me? And so I interviewed with him. He had just gotten a round of funding. It was another boutique. And he said, you'll be my assistant, but you can sign artists. You go get an act, you sign them, and you're off to the races. So I'm 22, and I'm trying to sign acts. I try to sign the Yin Yang Twins, and I meet with Mr. Kali Park, and I'm talking to DJ Smurf at the time, and I'm telling him, I want to be your agent. And he's like, you seem cool, you can bring us deals, but we're not signing with anybody. Right. And then I connect with Sean Paul, and Sean Paul's getting $4,000 a night doing Give Me the Light. And I convince him to go out to dinner with me. And I'm working trying to become his agent. But ultimately he says, I'm not going to be signing with you, but you can bring me deals. And we went on to do some amazing things international together and a lot more deals with him. But then the third act that I met at 22 was the Clips. And they were on the Grindin' Street Tour. Yeah. And it was a mess. And their manager essentially said, if you fix this tour, you can be our agent. And I had no idea how to fix the tour. I had no idea how to book a tour. I never did holds or any of that stuff. But my boss and I worked around the clock on weekends. We cleaned up the tour. We took it out of a lot of these kind of drug dealing street promoters, and we put it into some legit venues, and the song took off, and we ended up selling a lot of tickets, and it looked fantastic. And then the album came out and was #2 on the pop charts. So I'm 22 and I rep the #2 act on the pop charts. And then Nelly called, and Nelly invited them on tour. And then Jay-Z called and invited him on tour in Europe. And I went on most of those dates. And then 50 Cent called and invited them on the college tour. And then at that point, I got fired. Chris Lighty started managing him and brought it over to his brother to be the agent.
That's funny. I'm going to go two different ways because I actually want to do some education in there too. But let's start on the emotional side. Because I know some of your history, so I know that scenario kind of is going to replicate itself later on in the story. How did it feel that first time, getting scooped by basically the Lighties after having done all of that work and getting that first win? You guys were a major part of all of a sudden making this thing a legitimate thing, and then only to get kind of undermined and scooped up. Like, what were your feelings like, especially being only 22, 23 at the time?
Yeah, I mean, at this time I was probably 23 and a half, 24. Mm-hmm. I was very disappointed in my boss and the company I was working at. I felt like they weren't playing the game right. I also was blown away by Chris Lighty. Because in one regard, he was this, bulletproof office gangster managing 50 Cent and Busta Rhymes and Missy Elliott and telling me that he doesn't believe in contracts. He learned from Leor Cohen, there's no contract good, and he would rip it up in front of anybody's face. And how he's going to work out this deal with, these labels. Chris Lighty's going to work it out. He was going to work it out with their manager or their record label, and he was like telling us how he's gonna do the deal. He's like, I'm gonna put it in him slow, and I was like, this guy's amazing. And then he'll get up from the table and he'll be the one that cleans up the conference room, make sure it's organized for the next person, throws the trash in the garbage. And I'm like, this guy's on both sides of the equation. He's amazing.
What did you learn from that experience? that
mean,
you maybe applied to your stuff later on?
I pretty religiously clean up and organize the conference room after I leave. And I just remember him, just his work ethic and his business acumen and just how cutthroat he was, but clearly also cared about, his surroundings. And he never felt like a shark. He was always felt like he was going to tell me how it is, and this is what's going on. And we built a relationship. It's just, he had to pass this on. So, and it had run its course to some extent. I started to learn the golden rule of management, which is it's not when you're going to be fired. It's not if you're going to be fired. It's when. And I started to realize that this is not going to, artists are going to leave. And that's kind of how it's going to work. And the nice thing is I stayed very close with the Clips. And at this point, the Clips were sick of my boss and really liked me. And it just was time, so it hurt. And soon after, I ended up leaving that company and trying to figure out my next move. I ended up moving to California and getting into video games.
Interesting.
And leaving the agency world altogether for a couple of years. And so that was a big part of just feeling really upset that this amazing group that I got my start with and would do anything for, literally give the shirt off my back to, was put in a situation where they couldn't stick with me.
Were you done when you left? Did you think you were done with music when you went to California for the video game stuff?
I thought I was done with being an agent. I felt like agents of the past had this kind of stigma that I just didn't want. I didn't like these older agents. I didn't like the way they would talk on the phone to people. I didn't like the way they operated. It just felt like being an agent was not what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I felt like there was a much bigger opportunity in watching video game companies that were going public, and Bill Gates held the product up, and the stock went from 3 cents to $32, and they raised $650 million. And it became this business where I was like, this is so exciting. Every artist wanted to take my call. I had Kanye in the office, the Puff Daddy in the office. Everybody was on board.
And what were you doing specifically?
Entertainment marketing.
Ah, okay.
So we did a launch party in Europe, and I booked the talent for that. And then when they came to America, they said, we're going to bring you on board. And so I helped do the marketing inside of the company, and it was an amazing moment. The problem was that it ended up being an 11-page expose, and a lot of times when you raise this type of money and you've got a product, you can cut corners, and ultimately it didn't work and imploded, and my millions of dollars in shares ended up being worth nothing. It's still in my vault, but like it's a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a really unfortunate situation where 6 months of back pay ended up being owed, and just broken promises. And at that point I had enough of LA, and I moved back to New York at probably 27 and had a quarter life crisis.
Yeah.
And was like, what the heck am I going to do next?
Yeah. And so is that when the Nue Agency is born?
Yeah, I was ran into my buddy CL, who was running DigiWax.
Shout out to CL.
And he was doing fantastic. He had an office in Harlem, and he said, help me book some deals. I've got this new artist that I'm representing. He's signed to my record label. His name is Mims, and you could be his agent.
Yeah.
And you could work on my couch. And I basically worked out of a couch with Nue Agency just starting, and was going to do things different. And
what made you say yes? Because you obviously were very clear that you were done with what potential future you would look like screaming at artists on the phone. So were you operating as if I'm going to be different than those kind of people, or were you taking advantage of the opportunity that kind of was just laid out to you? without having any options necessarily to know what to do next?
Both.
Okay.
Both. I took the approach like I was going to do this innovative and different. I looked at technology. I looked at areas that the major agencies weren't messing with, and I found my lanes, which was technology and which was the college market. And I realized that these are two areas that if I can do a really good job in, I can develop the next generation of artists, and I can develop what I think is going to be the savior to the music business and bridge these gaps. And so that was kind of my focus in the early days at Nue. And from MIMS, we did a Microsoft deal, and the song went number 1 on the pop charts. And we started calling it Microsoft MIMS. And This Is Why I'm Hot was number 1. And that was a really good catalyst.
What kind of deal was that? To just be a little, dig in the weeds a little bit, what kind of deal was that? Was it just a sponsorship thing, putting the song in a commercial, or what was it?
Yeah, it was across the board. So it was a licensing. Mm-hmm. It was a tour sponsorship, which was where it fell really into my jurisdiction. And on top of that, CL landed a marketing gig for DigiWax for Microsoft Zune. So with MIMS being at the forefront of this, there was more deals to be done along the way.
And for those youngins that don't remember, Microsoft Zune was an MP3 player that existed before the iPod and iPhone took over.
It was trying to be the iPod killer or copier.
Yeah.
At that time, Microsoft's business model was basically let somebody else innovate and then do it better.
Yeah.
It's kind of like now Facebook's business model.
Exactly. I have to thank Microsoft and Zune for cutting checks to kids and all at the same time. For our second video with Estelle is in the Microsoft space in LA. I don't know if you remember when they had that. But yeah, we had an all-encompassing scenario as well over there. So.
Yeah, it was really exciting time for Microsoft. They had Xbox and Zune was good. Yeah. It was a pretty decent player. I mean, they just didn't have the vision of the iPhone.
Yeah, I think the integration was their fatal flaw. The functionality of it wasn't integrated across the board. I remember they sponsored some of our tour, and I remember trying to just like do behind the scenes stuff, just putting content on it, just putting music on it was a much more difficult process than it was with the iPhone at the time, and I think that was the Achilles heel. Especially
off of a Mac computer.
Yes.
Right? That was the big issue, was it wasn't interoperable.
Yeah. So Microsoft MIMS, This Is Why I'm Hot becomes, I think people don't realize that record was so massive.
It was monstrous. And then weirdly, at the same time, a friend of mine that I had met on Friendster told me about an artist he met on MySpace named Wale, and asked if I wanted to help in doing some bookings for Wale.
You might be the only person, the first and last person on this podcast that actually was still on Friendster when MySpace was around.
I think they weren't still there at the same time.
But you met them on Friendster.
I met him on Friendster when he was in college, Daniel Weissman.
Yes.
And then at the time he was DJ T-Dubs, and he hit me up on Friendster. Occasionally I get some like excited people to talk to me. And I then went from, he and I stayed friends while I was living in LA. And when he found Wale, he said, would you want to be the agent? I see what you're doing. And we started to look at things differently. At the time, I was going to a lot of conferences. I guess I still do. And at the Polestar conference, I heard a bunch of the hip hop promoters saying they wanted an artist that was going to do a band show. They felt like hip hop was not doing as well as it could live because it was track. It looked like a money grab. It just wasn't done with the same aesthetic and care that a rock and roll band was doing. And so it was hampering the fact that these songs were doing so well, but the touring was lacking.
Yeah.
And we talked about it, and Wale got it and loved it and said, I got something even better. I'll back myself with a go-go band. And it worked. It was a massive differentiator with us at the helm and we booking him. This was before Mark Ronson got involved. Then Mark got involved and Rich Kleiman. And then slowly Rock Nation got involved, and then Rick Ross. But at the time, Wale with a band was able to stand up against Kid Cudi and Drake. At one point that year, the three of them were on the cover of
GQ, I think they were.
as hip hop's kings. And it was like really hard for Wale to understand this, but he was getting Coachella, he was getting Bonnaroo because of his live experience.
Yeah, there was a very interesting time that was happening that I really actually want to do some documentation on. But New York at that time, I don't think people realize. A-Track was talking about it the other day on Twitter, kind of like the Kid Sister Pronails era and just all these crazy forces converging. Because what you have is, like we talked about with Microsoft, there was a space where it was just open in terms of like nothing was solidified yet. iTunes was not the winner. The iPhone and iPod was not necessarily the winner yet. Everybody was kind of like playing in the space. And at the same time, this is pre-streaming. This is blog era. And you had an ability for an artist like Wale, artists like ourselves, the Cool Kids, Kid Sister, whoever, to kind of like make a record in their bedroom. And then all of a sudden it was a major thing, whether it be YouTube videos or whether, there was very punk sort of innovation that was happening where you knew a shift was occurring from like the old music industry into the new one, but no one really knew where it would land yet. And so we existed. There's this very interesting time that's happening where, Wale can perform with a go-go band, or do stuff with Mark Ronson and Rhyme Fest. And I'm pretty sure that you did the show at Le Poisson Rouge was a Nue Agency show, right?
That was where I launched Sound Control.
Yeah.
It was an amazing bill. It was Wale,
And
J. Cole, and Big Sean.
Yeah, and that was the first time I met J. Cole in person, because I think our manager at the time had talked about him already. It was like, there's this guy from North Carolina. He's a big fan, yada, yada, yada. And then ran into him backstage there. This first time I met him.
I was representing all three.
Yeah.
And because Wale and Rich Kleiman introduced me to J. Cole. And J. Cole and I came up with a plan on how we were going to do colleges together. And we did his warm-up. And we started to set him up really nicely. And then at the same time, Dan Weissman started managing Mike Posner, and Mike Posner, who was still at Duke at the time, introduced me to Big Sean. So I'm basically, CL promoted me to one of his closets, and out of one of his closets in Harlem, I'm booking J. Cole, Big Sean, Mike Posner, Wale, Mims, and Digiwax is smoking.
Yeah.
And at that point, I called my brother, and I was like, "It's time to come up. I think we got something here."
Yeah. Talk about this a little bit. So you focused in on obviously the college tour circuit. Oftentimes, promoters will talk about, or agents will talk about hard ticket sale. Venues are really the places that you want to be. And to explain that, hard ticket sales versus soft ticket sales is you sell tickets to a show versus getting paid to go to a club where the crowd is already there. So hard ticket sales let you know how many people are actually coming to see you. But at a college show, it's in this weird space because the college is paying for the artist there. What made you focus in that space and know that you can then also, what was the strategy behind starting there and scaling then to bigger shows, hard ticket shows after it?
First of all, I really liked talking to college kids. I felt like they were the future and they were the passionate music fans. And one of the best ways to find out what's coming in music is to talk to the promoters. And the college kids seemed to know what was happening next. So I enjoyed the market. And I realized also that the big agencies hated that market, especially at that time. They looked at them as amateurs. It was a pain in the butt to work with the students. You had to walk them through it. There was always going to be headaches. And they didn't count the shows because they weren't hard ticket, right? The hard ticket shows are really what builds an artist's value in the marketplace, in the traditional business. So even though these colleges are huge paychecks, they didn't treat them with the respect. And so I looked at it as a competitive advantage. And I also looked at it as a lot of fun to work with. And I looked at it like there was more ways to skin the cat, so to speak, because we could do the after parties, we could do the frats, we could find the great interns. We built it as like a business. And then we started signing acts from that were in college or right out of college. I remember White Panda was like right out of college and they had jobs, and I was convincing them to not do these jobs and to give this a shot. And it worked out really well for them, even though apparently one of the members of White Panda, they broke up. One's Griffin now, and he's doing fantastic, Dan. And the other one, Tom, just has got his MBA from Harvard.
Amazing. So
go figure. But they ended up going back around, and I don't think they have any regrets on the way it worked out. But we were convincing artists like, what was his name? Hoodie Allen, to not take...
Shouts to Hoodie and UPenn, as always.
Yeah, to not take the gig at Google and to follow his heart and to tour. Yeah. And so the hard tickets plays were great in terms of building value, in terms of getting festival trust. You need to kind of play both games because those college payments were huge. You could couple them with a frat, and it was also a great lead source. Yeah. So many people that I know now are like promoters that I sold shows to, or we sold shows to when they were at a frat or the school boards. Like, these are the future. Yeah. And so I loved it as a market. I mean, I also loved in terms of soft ticket or privates was the corporate. Yeah. Which is how I built the business that I'm doing today.
There was something very interesting, I think, that Questlove said, and he was talking about college shows. And someone had asked him why the Roots were still big or as big as they have been as a touring band. And he said very specifically, it was the amount of college shows that they did in the variety of iterations that they did it with. So they would go out with, maybe it would be themselves one time, then they'd be going out with, let's say, a rock band or Rage Against the Machine or something like that, then go out with somebody else. But what they said is by becoming people's favorite bands at college, those people eventually go to a company. And then if you're at Bacardi and someone's like, hey, who should we get to do this whatever event? Oh, the Roots, because I saw them in college and it was the greatest weekend ever. And putting in the work in a variety of ways, but definitely putting in the work there in that building in that market, I think is extremely crucial when you're thinking about a long-term career, because those people in 5 years and in 10 years, as you've seen, are going to be in positions of power that then they can give back, you know.
And as a college student, I just remember every show I went to or saw or experienced. It was so impactful in my growth as a person. Whereas like now I'll go to 3 shows a week or something. I don't even remember what I did last week. Whereas I could tell you every gig, every performance, every set that I saw in college. So I remember that it being a really important, impactful market, and finding talent in college and marketing talent in college. It just felt really right. And we got a lot of traction.
No, amazing. And so you're on top of the world. You have possibly the biggest artist at the time around. And then it changes.
Yeah, it became a very challenging job because of a bunch of reasons. Yeah. For one, booking tours, booking shows. Once you do it once, once you do it twice, you do the Live Nation deals, you do the festivals, it starts to feel monotonous. Yeah. I started to feel like a waiter, with all due respect, in a good restaurant and just going to get what these artists wanted. Second of all, it was extremely competitive and cutthroat. You know, the first time I saw Lighty's Fangs, it's nothing compared to what these talent agencies can unleash on you. Yeah. And the resources they have.
And so you got poached a bunch.
consistently.
Yeah.
And it was so frustrating. And just trying to figure out, like, my reputation was always who'd you lose, who'd you sign. And it just was a very thankless gig where I had to just kind of really hide behind the artists. And it just was really hard to compete with the genre that I was in with these big agencies long term.
And so at that time, were they not trying to buy you out, buy the company? Okay.
Yeah, not full on buy, but more like you can come. So I got offered the CAA gig, but not with my company. And my company was doing a lot more interesting stuff. We were doing Spotify's marketing, and we were doing sound control and the Flash Forward Awards. And I just had passion for things outside of just like being an agent. Yeah. And so CAA's pitch to me was quite intimidating. It still kind of haunts me. And they were like, this was Kara at the time. She said, we think you're good. You could be one of the greats, but you'll never be one of the greats playing for a small independent team. The only way you're going to really show what you're made of is if you come here and if you win a championship with the Yankees and bring nobody except your roster.
And you didn't bite.
There's a couple times in my life where I've been offered jobs, and I'm not going to say that, like, in that cold day in January where you start all over again and you got to kind of hustle up the new business, that I don't wish that somebody was paying me versus me paying everybody. But I think that I didn't bite then, and who knows what the future will bring.
Yeah. But you knew, at least in your gut, that it wasn't the right move at that point.
Everybody was telling me, you got to take the deal if you want to stay in business with these artists. Yeah. And instead, I really had this mentality of like, kill or be killed. I started to turn into this person that was just, I looked a lot older than I did at 30, than I do at 40. Yeah. But I was just every day in the concrete jungle. And I had a beer with my buddy, who's now a meditation guru. But at the time, he was like, it sounds like you need therapy. And then from there, I think meditation would be helpful for you.
Okay.
And I couldn't believe it. I was like, he was like, that sounds horrible. What do you mean this concrete jungle? Like, you're working with all these amazing artists. It seems great. Like, you're doing fantastic. And I was just like, it was tough.
Yeah.
And I was overwhelmed. And I took his advice and I did therapy. And then I, after about 6 months, started meditating.
What kind of meditation?
Transcendental.
Okay.
So twice a day. Mm-hmm. And I took it very serious. And I started to change. And I started to realize I don't want to be in the artist representation business. Mm. And I maybe booked one more tour with, ambition and a couple other things. And I think at that point I said, I want a different business. I love having my own company, but I think I need a rebrand.
So taking that time to settle in, work on yourself a little bit, was where the shift came from. It wasn't from outside pressures because you kept getting kind of poached.
I saw clearly the play thanks to meditation and working on myself.
Okay.
And I realized a rebrand is going to be a big, bold move that I need to do. It feels like in this business, every 5 years, you need to reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
But my proudest accomplishment, looking back now that we're 2020 of the last decade, was being able to reinvent myself from an artist representation firm to this culture marketing, new wave music agency.
Yeah. And so what was the first thing that you did starting over? You kept the same company name.
Which made it easy for bank purposes and for just flow.
Yeah.
But it was a re-education process.
Yeah. And so what was the first pitch? What was the idea? Because now you're coming to brands in a different way.
The first pitch kind of came to me. A good friend of mine and an artist that I used to represent met on a plane, and they got off the plane with this master plan to help Sour Patch Kids get into the music space. And they basically had it scrolled out on napkins, and they said it to me over the phone, both so excited. I'm like, you guys. And I wrote it out, and then we scoped it out, and we pitched it to the brand. And ultimately, they bought into a program called The Patch, which was this, at the time, really innovative emerging music platform that Sour Patch Kids owned, that we ran. And it was the concept that Sour Patch Kids was this emerging candy brand against Skittles and all the others in their Starbursts in their market. And they wanted to align themselves with emerging musicians. And by doing so, artists on the rise, they could be affiliated with. And it was this really interesting way to create social content. And it allowed them to align with a lot of artists. We isolated a pain point, which is on the touring side of these emerging artists, was where they stay.
Yeah.
And so we took over a brownstone in Brooklyn to start, and we really designed it and thought it out clearly, brought in an experiential agency and designed it so that it was extremely tastefully done. And this became a hub for artists to stop in and to stay at.
Ah.
And we started with, because we know artists early and we're in early with folks, we launched the program with ex-ambassadors before they had a radio record or anything. And that year they had the #1 record on rock radio. Artists like Halsey would stay at the house when she was playing the studio at Webster Hall. But because the ascend was so high, 6 months later, she was, selling out Madison Square Garden. And so we had over the course of the program, it lasted 3 years, 400 artists stay. We had 3 houses at one point going at the same time in Austin, Texas, and then the Hollywood Hills. And it generated all these impressions for Sour Patch Kids on social. Artists were saying, I love making music with my friends because there was a studio down in the basement. And thank you, Sour Patch Kids. And it became this really interesting content engine. And, the program went on to win a Clio, which is like the Grammys of advertising, and was a great first foray into showing our chops as a culture marketing agency. Simultaneously, Elliot Wilson, who was, this reinvented magazine editor turned blogger, was out at all of the shows covering what was going on. And me and him struck up a friendship. And we were trying to figure out a way to collaborate on something. And we landed on an idea that we were going to do a Kendrick Lamar interview, that he was going to interview Kendrick at South by Southwest last minute. And I produced it, and he killed it. And Kendrick was on fire at the moment. And at the end of the interview, he whispered in my ear, I think we can sell tickets. I think we got something here. And we went back and forth on what we were going to call it and how is it going to work. This is before live podcasts and all of that. And we launched a program called Crown, with Tyler, the Creator, being our first guest. And then couldn't even get a venue at the time. We had to do it at midnight in Highline Ballroom because nobody would give us a venue for an interview at another time. And we sold out in 24 minutes. And then the next day, Ebe, J. Cole's manager, called and said, what was that new thing you guys are doing? I want to do it with Cole. So we did again a midnight show. Ended up 3 a.m. With Cole. And then immediately after, Drake hit Elliot and was like, yo, I'm the biggest artist in the world. I'm going to do the biggest interview in the world. I'm going to do your series. I'm going to be the biggest crown you ever did. And something along those lines, Drake's braggadocious ways. I think it was probably a little more coherent, but I remember seeing the email from him and being like, holy cow, Drake is hitting us up wanting to do a crown. And so our third crown was Drake. We're now 37 in.
Yeah.
And, last week we did Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. They called us.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Rented the Apollo.
Yeah.
Prime time. And, the show continues to roll.
So those two things are happening simultaneously, but you still have essentially a booking agency. So how did you shift personnel at the same time that you were mentally shifting to be able to handle all of this stuff, when before all they had to worry about was contracts, tour routing, and things like that? Now they're all of a sudden facing the other direction.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a cold winter.
Okay.
We took a little time to rock and roll, and a lot of us had to shift and grow. I mean, I'm a natural marketer and I studied it, but we had to relearn kind of what we were doing on the go. And a lot of mistakes were made and a lot of lessons were learned, and a lot of the team left and went on their own ways. And it was a little bit of a scary time because we were trying to figure out what we were going to do next. And it was not easy, and it was a process. Even the rebrand, we were lucky enough to get Red Antler, which is like the hottest branding agency in New York, to do our rebrand. But it took a process.
Yeah.
And I think the company looked very different in 1 year. But the biggest issue was perception with the agencies who I needed to book talent from for various clients. All thought I was a booking agent.
Yeah, so they're thinking.
So they were still like not trying to share information, and they were confused, and it didn't feel right. Why would they be helping us book talent when I was trying to steal their talent? It took a while of education and success.
How did you get through that? Was that just a communication thing, or once they saw checks coming from brands, it was like, okay, well, he's bringing us money. It's different then.
Yeah, I mean, it took a couple years.
Yeah.
I still get calls from people being like, you should book this artist in colleges, but less and less.
Okay.
It took time.
Yeah.
It took time, and it took a lot of persistence, but I love where I sit now with the agencies. Now they call me up and send me fruit baskets and ask to come by, and constantly we're sharing information, and like, it's a lot better of space. I sleep a lot better at night representing brands than I did with representing bands.
No, I'm sure. At the same time, you started a newsletter. Was that part of the rebrand? Is kind of like, I want to end up in people's emails often talking about this thing that is not booking.
While I was doing the booking stuff, I was doing a thing called sound control.
Yeah.
And so sound control basically started in a way to find leads in the tech space that I could bring in for my clients. And we started to put on these events and panels, and Pepsi wanted to sponsor them. And we started doing them at Internet Week, and the RSVPs were like off the hook. So I realized there was something here. And I was also building a bridge with all these tech founders that I really believed were going to save the business. It was a bad time for the music business when you were coming up.
Yeah.
Like, everybody was looking at it like, this ain't the glory days. I mean, now it's doing amazing again, and I feel like it's just getting started.
Yeah, the funniest thing I heard was my partner, Kids in the Hall Knowledge, was at YouTube a couple years ago, and he was there with someone else doing some education stuff. And, they were like, oh yeah, we know you. Like, they pulled up like our videos, like driving down the block and all that sort of stuff, and see kind of these numbers of, 900,000 or something like that. And they're just like, oh man, you guys were so famous, but didn't stay around long enough for like the swing back when those would have been 10, 20 million, like the numbers. If I always tell people that era had happened now, it would be such a different game, the superstars that would have been built, but it was so hard to survive through that because again, everyone's like, there's no money in this, there's nothing going on, and there was not enough trust across the board to get those things to work. And the only ones who've survived are the few that were able to get major label deals and float through it and make it to the other side.
And these labels just were in a very different spot, right? Until Spotify came around, they just were not in a position to fund artists. Now they're doing fantastic. They got huge payouts on Spotify's IPO, and they've got a great business model attached to the streaming business. Plus, they're leaner. They're doing 360 deals. Like, they're just, it's a scary time right now because they're doing too well again. And I think the growth is going to continue. So the newsletter was basically, to go back to your question, spawned off of Sound Control and Flash Forward. Because at this point, we probably had 10,000 RSVPs for our various events, and I wanted to keep doing the events. I loved them, but it just wasn't scalable, and it was taking time away from what we were trying to do, and it just ultimately didn't feel like it was going to be a big enough business for us, and it was taking a lot of time. So we parlayed it to a digital play. And we just decided to make it a newsletter. And that became an opportunity for me to write and develop a point of view and still have a platform. And it's really been a fun experience for me because every week I'm reading 100 articles, right? I got my printouts and I'm taking notes on them. And then I'm sharing that information and I'm developing a POV and I'm writing on top of it. And it takes about 5 hours a week, but it really keeps my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the industry. And now, year 3 of doing this, or 4 maybe even, I really feel like I'm seeing everything that's happening in the space, and I really understand the ins and outs of it. So it's like going to the gym, essentially, when it comes to what's happening in trends and in music.
Certainly. And I am a subscriber. And I run into this very interesting sort of conundrum. I'm a very, tech-savvy guy, was an engineer, so I can internalize this stuff pretty easily and kind of pay attention to trends and like, oh, okay. But so many artists that I deal with and talk to, and especially artists that are kind of coming up, this balance of art versus all of this marketing and content creation and all of that, it feels like for so many of them, this really crazy imbalance now where all this, whether it be chatbots, whether it be, now everything is about text messaging. There's all these things that they're supposed to do because these are the things that are going to make them famous or build their businesses, except the actual thing that they want to do, which is make music. If you were to advise an artist in that space, what would you tell them, knowing that obviously all the trends that are coming, but how do young artists today balance this content creation versus just actually making good art?
The big problem is that thanks to Spotify and Netflix and these platforms, it's a demand for more content. The fans are thirsty. Every week, 20,000 new songs come out on Spotify, 50,000 new songs come out on YouTube. So this is just, the audience is building this insatiable appetite where there's no way to serve them, but they're not going to go back. They don't want the album from 3 weeks ago in the same way that they want that new song. And so I think you got to look at it from a new up-and-coming artist. Again, it depends on the artist. It depends on the genre. It depends on the goals. Each thing is different. There's no cookie-cutter formula, at least the way I approach this in marketing. But the real thinking is you've got to flood. You've got to constantly create. Equality matters less than just being top of the social graph.
But to push back that on a little bit, the artists that you represented, especially the ones that have solidified their position, they do the opposite of that. Cole, Kendrick, Wale, Mike Posner, these are people that you will see sparingly. They still are able to maintain the old school sort of mysterious, the mystery that artists used to maintain. They're not really on social media like that. Like, you don't really see much from Big Sean or any of those people. But then when they come out, there still is this demand for the new music when it drops.
Because they built real fans through touring.
Yeah.
And through connecting.
But is there a way to do that path now? Without having to ridiculously, deal in, I have to make memes every day, or I have to, do whatever on TikTok, weird dances or the microwave challenge in order to get
constantly be
people
on
to
rap
pay
caviar.
attention. Yeah.
Less and less, because the fan is less and less loyal, right? At that time, you had to stay with these artists because that was what was out. Yeah. There wasn't social media in the same capacity. There wasn't that way to be deep with these artists on a regular basis. Now it's more than ever, you catch hot fire, and then in order to keep the flame burning, you got to keep feeding the beasts.
Yeah.
Because someone else will grab it. So I think that, like, they have real fans that are loyal, they were able to build their fan base. That I think in this day and age, you can do it. But I feel like the key to it is to constantly be getting people talking. I mean, it's even Kanye, like, he flooded the market last year.
Yeah.
He did 5 albums in
a month or something.
In a month. Yeah. He did 2 album releases. He did his own things. None of it was quality. It's quality to some extent, but there's no classics in there. There's a couple great tracks, and it was interesting how he did it. But what he did was he stayed top of the social graph. He took over the zeitgeist and was the #1 earning artist in the world last year. Yeah. And it had to do with some Adidas stuff, but the music was the driver for his relevance, which was then he was able to be in the position
to leverage everything else,
to turn into, a billionaire.
But then do you think that the way that this creativity, or the way that the flooding the content situation exists now, it's going to keep us from getting true superstars for a while? Because in this iteration, I would say Cardi B is probably the only true superstar to come out of this new era who did it, who worked it the way that where there's content. But to me, there really aren't. There's one. And I still feel like she would have succeeded in she probably could have succeeded in any time, given enough runway like she had to kind of develop and find the success.
Yeah, there's a real superstar, that future superstar deficit that the industry's facing. That's scary. Because if you look at the top 10 touring acts in the world, all of them are over the age of 40 or Gen Xers, right? It's U2, it's Bruce Springsteen, it's the list is very old. Madonna, that are the top grossing, Bon Jovi, the top grossing touring acts. But if you look at the top artists on streaming, all of them are under 33. So how are these streaming artists going to translate into touring artists on the level that these superstars of the past are? There's a real issue.
Yeah.
It's an upcoming recession of superstars that you can foresee coming because of this clear model of these young streaming acts that are coming in and coming out so fast and not translating to loyal fans. That, are you going to grow old with these artists? Is Lil Uzi Vert the fan of Lil Uzi Vert at 40 or 50 going to buy tickets to see him in the same way they do for Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah. I do wonder if the bottom is going to fall out of the touring game, because when you started, like you said, hip hop was not really a touring genre yet. And now you're watching people go from no shows to 5,000 shows, 5,000 cap venues instantly, because again, the thing is moving on social media. So there's no growth that's happening where they get to have a bunch of shitty 150 person shows before they realize, or before they scale to the 1,000 to the 2,500.
Roddy Ricch is probably selling out 5,000 tickets with no SOBs play. Yeah,
and you see the kink in that when you look at someone like Summer Walker, who is pushing back on that because they really aren't ready. And do you think that we are pushing all these people to scale so fast, and now we're doing these amphitheaters and huge venues, but once a round of shitty shows occurs at that scale, no one wants to go back to see that again. But they're still getting booked because the numbers say it should happen. And we see, a couple of big superstars over the end of last year having to cancel entire tours because the scale just wasn't there.
That's why the festival market's working so well, right? Because you can put a bunch of them together and the sum of the whole is worth more than the parts. Yeah. So I think that the live music business has a lot to think about. It's beyond just the dynamics of these artists and their growth and like maybe not respecting or their value being more than their hard ticket value. It's also the dynamic of Live Nation and Ticketmaster doing extremely well and being super well positioned and making it really hard for independent promoters to come into the business and for the data to be mined in a way that these artists really could find useful. The biggest problem I see in the music business is the record business doesn't know who their consumers are. They're still going through Spotify and they're still going through Tower Records. There's no D2C. And the artists don't know who their consumers are on the live shows because you're going through Ticketmaster and you're going through Live Nation. So there's no direct-to-consumer conversation except on social. And there's a big connect on the transactions. Yeah. And if the music business can connect the dots between their fans and their consumers and their product, they can cut out a lot of fluff and make a lot more money.
Yeah, there's a weird thing there's a weird rub that also happens in there though. I was talking with an artist and they were asking some fans, like some younger kids, like, oh, how do you support an artist that you like? And they were like, oh, I follow them on Twitter and Instagram. And you realize it's this weird situation where that is not actual direct, support really in any way. And you have this new generation of fans that are coming up rarely ever spending money on anything. They don't have the same sort of connection where it's like, oh, I bought this CD, I need to sit here and like it, at least 2 songs off of it, or figure out why I don't like it, but I have to make a decision because I spent $17.99. Now everything can kind of just be tasted and it's just like, no, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that, oh, kind of like that. But you aren't really putting the extra effort into becoming a supportive fan.
I agree. I think it needs to change. I mean, it's better than it was when there was nobody that would even buy a CD.
Of course.
Right? When the industry was so greedy that there was an era in the 90s or early 2000s where you were selling $19 CDs that cost $1 to make by the 10 times million amounts. Now, then there was an era where fans were like, F the music business, they're greedy, and I can get this CD for free, and music started to be perceived as free.
Yeah.
Now at least they're fine paying bundles or subscriptions, maybe to multiple. Music is being consumed more than ever, and a lot of money is being spent in music.
Yeah.
It's just how you get it directly to the artist is a different conversation. And some of it's merch.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's,
right? It's become a merch business, or that's a huge ancillary income.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that, I was told by somebody that, like, yeah, the way you make money in this game has nothing to do with the music sales anymore. It's all about all the ancillary. Obviously, touring still a huge piece, but in that, merch and whatever sponsorship and whatever else you can kind of sell. Unless
you're direct, right? And if you're direct and you're getting this type of streams, it can be very lucrative.
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, in wrapping this up, because I think that we can get in the weeds for it regarding this. Speaking on that point, and speaking of, maybe it's either direct to fan or sort of indie artist stuff, what are you looking forward to, either technology-wise or potential marketing-wise in 2020 that you think could be helpful or transformative for artists in their business?
Yeah, my belief is that every brand should have a music strategy. So my customers are now the brands, and I see musicians wanting to do more and more brand deals, and I see brands needing a competitive edge when they can't buy a commercial on MTV and have the same impact, or even influencer marketing starting to kind of lose its momentum and authenticity. I see more and more brands wanting to play in music, especially as these smart speakers are growing. There's a real opportunity to grow that space. And so my passion point is trying to figure out how to bring more brands into music and help them develop impactful, meaningful music strategies. And as the live space is growing and the streaming space is growing, the brand spends in music is growing, but at a smaller and slower rate. It's been 3% the past 2 years. So how do we bring more brand dollars into music? And by doing so, that's going to support the emerging artists, the mid-tier artists. I think this can be a real growth business for marketing bands that are on the rise, and even bands that have loyal fan bases. So that's my kind of big mission, is how do I do that more effectively, and how do we help brands understand why they need to be in music and what's happening in music, so where they can best fit in.
Makes sense. Taking it back to the beginnings with Microsoft MIMS.
Yeah,
really, ultimately.
I mean, yeah, but now it's a way more sophisticated, way more robust way of doing it than just like sponsoring a tour,
of course,
or doing a music video. Yeah. There's real ways. Artists are open to partnering, and times have changed, and I think they've changed for a number of reasons. But one is the entrepreneurial spirit of hip hop. When you see artists owning brands and making billions of dollars doing so, or hundreds of millions, it becomes a real interesting idea for an artist to partner with a brand that they're passionate about. And then on top of it, how you cut through the noise, like we were saying, a lot of it's a cosign. A lot of it's a remix. A lot of it's a hat tip. A lot of it's a producer or a brand.
Yeah.
Right. Bud Light co-signing Post Malone was big for him and his credibility in the festival world, in the live space, in the music business overall. Brands co-signing artists allows them to have not only money, resources, marketing materials, but also a hat tip that shows they're legit.
No, definitely. I think people don't talk enough about, even like a recent story like Lizzo, don't talk about how her flashpoint happens from syncs. It doesn't happen, everyone thinks she came out of nowhere. She'd been around, but it was a couple licensing syncs that changed everything, to what we know now of Lizzo. And so, yeah, brands I definitely think will be more influential, and hopefully you'll be the person to put two and two together. But man, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much
really
for your time.
Great to see you. Welcome back to New York.
New York, we're here.